Eric Lawson had never been one for violence. Growing up on the dusty moon colony of Tarsus IV, he spent his days fixing ships, engines, anything mechanical that needed his attention. His father had been a mechanic too, and when Eric was younger, he'd always dreamed of following in his footsteps, working with machines, avoiding the harsh realities of life outside the colony walls. But that dream shattered the moment the sirens wailed. Tarsus IV had always been a peaceful place. At least, that's what he had always told himself. The colony had little to offer the outside world, aside from a strategic location between trade routes. The most excitement the people ever experienced was a shipment delay or the occasional meteor shower. But then the shore of Empire arrived. Eric still remembered the sound of the first explosion. It was deafening, shaking the ground beneath his feet, rattling every pane of glass in his house. His mother had been in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when it happened. His father was on the upper levels, working on the engines for a new freighter. Neither of them made it out. He had tried to find them in the ruins, calling their names in desperation, but the wreckage was too vast. The firestorms from the bombardment were too intense, and the scent of burning fuel filled his lungs as he stumbled through the smoldering streets. There was no time for mourning. As the colony burned, Eric's world had ended. The Shorv didn't waste time. They came down in their towering war machines, their alien forms terrifying to behold, and they took everything. Technology, food supplies, the people, everything. A handful of resistance groups had been scattered, but Eric knew they stood little chance. He barely had time to think before a military officer, flanked by soldiers in dark armor, pulled him aside. "You're coming with us," the officer said gruffly, his voice devoid of compassion. "We need anyone who can fix things. There's a war to fight." At first, Eric resisted, but there was no other option. His grief boiled into rage, and he followed the officer to the makeshift camp where the remaining survivors were being gathered. They had little left, and everything was in disarray. His skills as a mechanic were put to use almost immediately, repairing weapons, shielding systems, anything that might help them survive. But it was never enough. No matter how hard he worked, no matter how much blood was spilled, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that they were doomed. A few days later, he was given a new task. The military needed him to accompany a group of soldiers to the front lines. A convoy of supply ships had been ambushed by shore forces, and the survivors needed extraction. Eric had never been a soldier, had never even held a gun before. But when the officer handed him a plasma rifle, the weight of it was a cruel reminder that there was no escaping this war. As the convoy rumbled toward the front, Eric couldn't help but feel the weight of everything that had happened. Tarsus IV was gone. His family was gone. The life he'd known was lost forever. The thought of taking up arms to avenge them filled him with disgust. He wasn't a fighter, never had been. Yet here he was, thrust into a conflict far beyond anything he could have imagined. The convoy neared the extraction zone, and the ground rumbled as distant artillery fire echoed across the desolate landscape. Eric gripped the rifle tightly, his palms slick with sweat. He had no idea what awaited them, but he knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning. As the team prepared to disembark, Eric's mind raced. He didn't know how to fight. He didn't want to fight. But his heart burned with the desire to stop the destruction of everything he loved. If this was the only way, then he would find strength, somehow, wherever he could. The ground cracked open beneath their feet, and the first wave of Shorv soldiers appeared on the horizon. Eric Lawson was about to learn that even the most reluctant warrior could find strength in the unlikeliest places. The first shots rang out like thunderclaps, sharp and unforgiving. Eric's heart pounded in his chest as the convoy's military vehicles screeched to a halt, and soldiers scrambled out of the armored transports. The dust kicked up by the explosions stung his eyes, making everything feel like a nightmare. He stumbled out of the transport, his rifle awkwardly clutched in his hands, barely managing to remember the basic combat stance that had been drilled into him during his hastily arranged training. "Move!" barked Sergeant Kessler, a veteran of the war, as he rushed past Eric, his weapon raised. Kessler had been a hard-ass since day one, treating Eric like a liability. "We've got incoming. Stick close and keep your head down." Eric nodded absently, his mind too clouded with fear and uncertainty to fully process the command. He had never seen anything like this. The shore soldiers, with their terrifying angular armor and insectoid features, were charging toward them, their weapons crackling with lethal energy. The sound of their boots hitting the dirt felt like an impending doom. Eric's fingers trembled as he lifted his rifle, but before he could even take aim, a soldier beside him dropped to the ground with a deafening cry. The chaos of war unfolded around him in a blur. The screams of the wounded, the thudding explosions, the staccato rhythm of plasma fire. His training seemed to fail him. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't supposed to be here. But then, something in him shifted. A shore soldier broke through the line, its long, segmented limbs moving with disturbing precision as it barreled toward Eric. He froze for a split second, his mind locking up, but then the instincts buried deep within him surged to life. Without thinking, Eric dove to the side, rolling behind the nearest vehicle for cover. His rifle was still clutched tightly in his hands, and he aimed it at the approaching alien with a precision he didn't know he had. His first shot missed, ricocheting off the armor of the shore warrior, but the second struck true. The alien staggered back, its form twitching violently as it crumpled to the ground. Eric's breath caught in his throat, a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration flooding his veins. He had killed something. "Not bad, Lawson," Sergeant Kessler's voice cut through the chaos. "But don't get cocky. Get back in the fight." Shaking, Eric forced himself to rise, his legs unsteady beneath him. His rifle felt like it weighed a ton, but he kept firing, his shots becoming more controlled with each passing second. Despite the terror gnawing at the back of his mind, Eric realized something. He wasn't just surviving. He was adapting, learning on the fly. His mechanical mind, always so attuned to the inner workings of engines and machines, was now processing the battlefield in the same way. The convoy, though outnumbered, began to regain ground. Soldiers moved with a terrifying synchronicity, using the vehicles as cover and firing in perfect coordination. Eric found his rhythm, sliding into place as the battle unfolded around him. He started to see patterns, the way the shore soldiers moved, their weak points in their armor, the best angles for taking them down. He wasn't a soldier by nature, but his mind was wired to find solutions in any situation. As the battle raged on, Eric's group slowly began to push forward. The shore forces were relentless, but they couldn't match the sheer determination of Eric's team. The ambush had been expected, but the shore underestimated the human spirit. At some point, the sounds of battle began to fade into the background as Eric's focus narrowed. He wasn't thinking about the war anymore, nor the fact that he was fighting to avenge his family. All that mattered was the next move, the next action, how to stay alive, how to keep his team alive. By the time the last of the shore soldiers had fallen, the field was littered with bodies. The sky, once choked with the smoke of battle, now stood eerily still. Eric's breathing was ragged, his muscles aching from the tension. But he didn't feel like a mechanic anymore. For the first time, Eric Lawson felt like something else, something stronger, something capable of more than he ever imagined. Sergeant Kessler clapped him on the back, hard enough to make him stumble. "Nice work, kid. You've got potential." Eric didn't respond, his hands still shaking as he surveyed the aftermath. He had survived his first taste of war, but he knew that this was only the beginning. There was more to come, more to lose, and the weight of it all sat heavy on his shoulders. But one thing was clear now: he had found strength in the unlikeliest of places. Whether he was ready for what lay ahead didn't matter. He wasn't going to run from this fight. Not anymore. The days following the battle were a blur. The convoy's forces regrouped in the shattered remnants of a nearby town, setting up a temporary base of operations. Eric had expected to feel relief after the chaos, but instead, a hollow sense of dread clung to him. He wasn't sure if it was the constant smell of burned flesh or the unnerving quiet after the violence, but something in him had shifted irreparably. The war was no longer something he watched from afar. It was his reality now, inescapable and unforgiving. Sergeant Kessler kept him busy. There was no time to dwell on the dead, no time for mourning. The wounded needed tending to, supplies needed to be organized, and the mechanics of war required constant maintenance. But despite his growing exhaustion, Eric couldn't shake the image of the shore soldier he had killed, the way its body had dropped like a rag doll when his shot found its mark. It haunted him, gnawing at the edge of his thoughts. He was pulled from his reverie by the shrill sound of comms alert. The base was on high alert again. "Lawson," Kessler's voice crackled through his earpiece. "Gear up. We've got another mission." The war had a rhythm now, an almost predictable cadence of attack and retreat. The shore were relentless, always probing for weaknesses. The human forces, stretched thin across multiple fronts, were forced to improvise, strike when they could, and retreat when necessary. But Eric had learned something in the few days since the first battle. The shore were not invincible. They had their weaknesses, their blind spots, and with enough strategy, they could be beaten. That thought kept Eric going as he quickly donned his armor and reloaded his rifle. His mechanical background had made him an unlikely soldier, but now it was his greatest asset. He could see the way things fit together, how the ships flew, how the weapons worked, how each soldier moved in sync with the others. The patterns were there, if you were willing to look for them. The mission was simple: escort a convoy of vital supplies to a nearby resistance outpost. The route was dangerous, but the convoy was heavily armored, and the soldiers had been trained for this kind of engagement. Eric was assigned to the back of the convoy with a small group of soldiers, and despite the growing tension in the air, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of something else. Confidence, maybe. For the first time, he wasn't entirely unsure of himself. The convoy rolled out, the engines of their heavily armored transports growling as they bounced over the rough terrain. Eric found himself at the back of the line, scanning the horizon as the landscape around them shifted from desolate plains to rocky cliffs. The sky, usually an oppressive shade of gray, was clear for once, and for a moment, Eric almost felt at peace. But the peace was fleeting. It didn't take long before the first signs of shore activity appeared, a flash of movement in the distance. The first explosion erupted just to the right of the convoy, sending debris flying into the air. Eric's heart raced as he slammed his hand on the comms button. "Ambush, we've got incoming." The convoy jerked to a halt as the ground rumbled with the sound of heavy footfalls. The shore war machines, massive, towering constructs of metal and alien design, emerged from behind the cliffs, their weapons glowing with an ominous energy. The soldiers reacted immediately, spreading out and taking cover behind the armored transports. Eric's rifle felt heavier now, the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders more palpable than ever. He wasn't just protecting himself anymore. He was protecting the convoy, the supplies, the future of the resistance. His hands clenched around the rifle, his training taking over as his mind went into tactical overdrive. They couldn't afford to lose this shipment. The shore knew it was valuable, and they wouldn't stop until they had it. "Form a defensive perimeter." Kessler's voice barked over the comms as the convoy soldiers quickly sprang into action. Eric's pulse quickened as he found a position behind a transport's armored flank, his eyes scanning the approaching shore forces. They were fast, methodical, more organized than the last encounter. But this time, Eric wasn't paralyzed by fear. He had seen how they moved, how they fought. He could predict it. A shore soldier broke through the line of fire, charging directly toward Eric's position. Without hesitation, he aimed his rifle and squeezed the trigger. The shot landed square in its chest, and the alien's form crumpled to the ground. Eric didn't have time to feel satisfaction. Another wave of shore soldiers surged forward, this time with heavier firepower. Kessler's voice crackled again, sharp with urgency. "Lawson, we need more firepower. Hit their flanks now." Eric's heart pounded, but his mind was clear. His hands moved with a precision he hadn't thought possible, adjusting his aim as he took down another shore soldier. Each shot was deliberate, controlled, no longer fueled by panic, but by something else, something deeper. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for something bigger. The storm of battle raged around him, but Eric Lawson, the reluctant warrior, was no longer a mechanic. He had found his place in the chaos, and he would fight until the very end. The battle stretched on for what felt like hours. The shore forces were relentless, their tactics growing more complex with each wave. But the humans weren't backing down. Eric's rifle never stopped firing, the crack of each shot blending with the roar of explosions and the sharp staccato of plasma fire. Every inch of ground gained was hard-earned, each fallen shore soldier a reminder that their enemies, though powerful, could be beaten. Eric's eyes never stopped moving, constantly scanning the field for the next threat. His senses, once overwhelmed by the chaos, were now sharper than ever. He could hear the faint hum of an incoming shore war machine, could spot the telltale signs of an enemy soldier preparing to fire. His instincts were becoming his greatest weapon, and with each passing moment, he felt a growing sense of purpose. This wasn't just about survival. It was about pushing the enemy back, about making sure they didn't win. Kessler's voice broke through the noise. "Lawson, move up. We've got a gap in the line." Eric didn't hesitate. He dropped to one knee, checked his rifle, and took off running, dodging behind rocks and debris as the battle raged around him. The adrenaline surged through his veins, drowning out everything else. His mind was entirely focused on the task at hand, but deep inside, there was a creeping realization. He wasn't the same man who had been thrown into this war. The reluctant mechanic had become something else, a soldier. A warrior, a protector. He reached the gap in the line, where several soldiers were pinned down by enemy fire. Their shields flickered, struggling to absorb the incoming plasma blasts. Eric didn't waste time thinking. He crouched low, aimed his rifle, and fired in quick succession. The shore soldier at the front of the assault squad dropped to the ground with a grunt. Another followed, and another. Covering fire, Eric shouted, his voice hoarse from the strain. His shots rang out in rapid succession, suppressing the enemy fire long enough for the pinned soldiers to regroup and return fire. Kessler's voice crackled through the comms again, this time with a note of approval. "Nice work, Lawson. Keep pushing forward." The fight wasn't over, but Eric's confidence was growing with every moment. He could feel the tide turning. The shore were still powerful, but their coordination was slipping. They were adapting to the humans, but Eric and his fellow soldiers were adapting faster. They were learning, evolving in the heat of battle. Just as Eric took another step forward, the ground shook beneath him. A massive explosion rocked the battlefield, sending a shockwave that knocked him off his feet. His vision blurred as the world around him became a haze of smoke and dust. He struggled to regain his bearings, his ears ringing. For a brief moment, panic surged inside him. He wasn't sure what had happened, but he knew the explosion hadn't come from their side. "Lawson," Kessler's voice was distorted through the comms. "Get to cover. We've got incoming reinforcements." Eric scrambled to his feet, but his legs felt heavy, his vision still swimming. The explosion had thrown him off balance, but he couldn't afford to stay down. Not now. He forced himself to focus, to push the disorientation aside. His hands gripped his rifle, and with a deep breath, he sprinted toward the nearest building, hoping the rubble would provide some protection. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and burning metal. Eric's pulse thundered in his ears as he reached the cover of a nearby shattered wall. His eyes scanned the horizon, looking for the new threat. That's when he saw it. A massive shore warship descending from the sky, its engines glowing a deep, unnatural red. The warship was a sight to behold, gleaming black metal, sharp, angular edges that seemed to defy the laws of aerodynamics. It hovered above the battlefield, its enormous guns rotating into position. This wasn't just an assault. This was an all-out offensive. "We need air support now," Kessler's voice was urgent. Eric's heart sank. The air support had been expected hours ago, but it hadn't arrived. Without it, they were as good as dead. The warship's guns powered up, a deadly hum filling the air as it aimed at the convoy. Eric could see the soldiers scrambling to respond, but it was clear they were outmatched. Then, just as the first blast from the warship's main cannon fired, something unexpected happened. A flash of light tore through the smoke, and a streak of energy cut through the sky. The massive warship's hull buckled under the onslaught. The short ship faltered, then dropped from the sky, crashing to the ground in a fiery explosion. Eric blinked in disbelief. Had they just? "Surprise?" Kessler said with a grin. "Welcome to the real fight, Lawson." Eric turned toward his commander, his heart still racing. In the distance, the silhouettes of human fighter jets appeared, their engines roaring as they strafed the remaining shore forces. The tide had turned. The battle wasn't over, but humanity had just sent a message. Eric didn't have time to dwell on the significance. He was still in the middle of a war. But as he fired another shot into the advancing shore of troops, a grim realization settled in. This was his world now. A world of blood, steel, and the unrelenting will to survive. And for the first time, Eric Lawson truly believed he had the strength to fight back. The battle didn't stop after the shore warship crashed, far from it. If anything, the destruction only served to incite the enemy forces to greater fury. The remaining shore soldiers, now without their aerial support, fought with a savage desperation. Their movements were less coordinated, but each soldier was still a deadly opponent. Eric's hands shook as he reloaded his rifle, but his mind was clear. They had gained the upper hand, but victory was still far from assured. The human fighters tore through the skies, dropping bombs on the remaining shore artillery positions. Explosions lit up the horizon, a fiery contrast to the cold, lifeless landscape. Yet the battlefield was far from quiet. The crack of gunfire, the roar of engines, the constant hum of the remaining shore war machines, it was all a symphony of chaos. Eric ducked low behind a shattered wall, his rifle steady in his hands. His squad had pushed forward, covering the remaining resistance fighters as they secured the wreckage of the warship. But despite their success, Eric knew that the shore wouldn't let up so easily. They had tasted defeat now, and that only made them more dangerous. A sudden flare of light caught his attention. A blinding beam of energy shot across the battlefield, striking one of their transports in the distance. The vehicle exploded in a burst of fire, sending shockwaves through the ground. Eric's breath hitched. It was happening again. Another shore war machine had entered the fray. "Lawson," Kessler's voice crackled through the comms. "They're sending in their elite troops. We need to take them down now, or we'll lose everything." Eric's pulse spiked. The shore elite were terrifying, huge, hulking creatures in advanced armor. They were capable of taking down entire squads with ease, and now they were advancing on their position. His hands moved quickly as he checked his weapon and scanned the terrain. The sky was alive with the buzz of the jets above, but Eric knew that the real fight was on the ground. The convoy's remaining soldiers were already moving into position, but it would be up to Eric and a few others to hold the line until the air support could neutralize the elite forces. The first shore of elite soldier came into view. Its hulking figure emerged from the smoke, towering over the landscape, its weapon charged and ready. Eric's breath caught in his throat. He had faced plenty of shore soldiers before, but these were different. These were the monsters of war. He fired, but his shot ricocheted harmlessly off the elite soldier's armor. It barely flinched. The shore soldier retaliated with a burst of plasma that exploded just inches from Eric's cover, sending him sprawling to the ground. The heat singed his face, and the shockwave rattled his teeth. His head spun as he rolled behind a large piece of debris, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the sweat running down his back, his muscles screaming from the tension. "Eric," Kessler's voice came again, distant and strained. "Get your ass up and fight. They're closing in." Eric shook his head, trying to clear the fog. His vision sharpened. His body ached, but it was nothing compared to the desperation he felt. He couldn't let his team down. Not now, not when they were so close. His fingers tightened around his rifle as he risked a peek over the debris. The shore elite was charging, and in its massive hands, it carried a devastating energy weapon that crackled with lethal potential. It was coming for him. But Eric had something else in mind. He reached into his belt and pulled out a grenade. It wasn't much, but he knew he had to use whatever he could to slow the beast down. The grenade's timer started ticking. His heart raced as he steadied his aim. With a quick breath, Eric hurled the grenade directly at the elite soldier's feet. The explosion rocked the air with a deafening sound, and for a moment, Eric was blinded by the flash. The shore elite reeled back, momentarily stunned by the blast. Its shield flickered, and for the first time, its armor seemed vulnerable. "Now," Eric shouted, his voice hoarse from the strain. The remaining soldiers opened fire, their rounds slamming into the weakened armor of the elite soldier. The beast staggered, finally collapsing to the ground with a crash that sent dust and debris into the air. Eric felt a surge of triumph, but it was fleeting. The job wasn't done yet. There were more of them. Kessler's voice rang out again. "Good work, Lawson, but we've got more incoming. Get ready." The war wasn't over, but for the first time since the battle had begun, Eric didn't feel the same fear that had paralyzed him in the beginning. He had found something in the chaos, something he never thought he'd find, a warrior's resolve. The ground still shook, and the battle still raged on, but Eric had embraced his place in it. He would fight, he would survive, and he would make sure that the shore paid for every inch of land they tried to take. And as the enemy forces continued to push forward, Eric Lawson stood ready to meet them, no longer the reluctant mechanic, but a warrior forged in the crucible of war. The battlefield was a grotesque symphony of fire, smoke, and shattered metal. Despite their best efforts, the humans had been pushed back, their forces slowly thinning as the shore pressed their advantage. Eric's boots crunched against the rubble as he moved with his squad toward a fortified position. The once beautiful landscape was now a hellish wasteland, torn apart by the relentless war. But for all the destruction, for all the casualties, Eric could see the humanity in his fellow soldiers. Those who had fought with him, bled with him. They were more than survivors. They were a family forged in the flames of war. The enemy, however, was relentless. The shore had no such bonds. They were machines of destruction, programmed to tear apart anything in their path. And now, with their elite forces neutralized, they were bringing in reinforcements, hundreds of them, charging across the desolate field toward the human lines. Eric's hand tightened around his rifle. His breathing was steady, controlled, but beneath the calm, he felt a growing storm of anger and determination. The shore had underestimated humanity. They thought they could break them, but they didn't understand. They didn't understand that humans had a resilience that no enemy could shatter. "We can't hold them back forever," Kessler said, his voice grim as he surveyed the horizon. "We need a plan, and we need it now." Eric nodded, taking a quick glance over the field. The shore were advancing in waves, their heavy artillery moving toward the front lines, their infantry swarming like locusts. It was overwhelming, impossible to face head-on. But Eric wasn't about to back down. He had been trained for this moment. He had found his strength in the unlikeliest of places, and now he would use it. A glint of metal caught his eye. A Shorv machine, much like the one they had taken down earlier, was advancing toward them. Its cannons hummed with power, and its massive frame cast a long shadow across the battlefield. Eric didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle, sending a burst of plasma at its exposed hull. The shot glanced off, doing little more than drawing the machine's attention. "Fire at will!" Kessler shouted. The squad opened fire, each soldier aiming for weak points in the war machine's armor. But it was like trying to punch through a wall. The Shorv machine fired back, and the humans scattered for cover as the ground exploded around them. Eric could feel the heat of each blast, the shockwaves rattling his bones. They couldn't outshoot it, and they couldn't outrun it. Suddenly, a voice cut through the chaos. "Eric, the backup plan, now." It was Mason, another soldier in their squad. He had his eyes locked on something in the distance, something that Eric hadn't noticed until now. A set of explosive charges hidden under the bridge the Shorv were trying to cross. If they could detonate those charges, they could collapse the bridge and halt the Shorv advance. "We're going to need a distraction," Eric said, his mind already calculating, "and I've got just the thing." Without waiting for a response, he turned to Kessler. "Cover me." Before Kessler could protest, Eric bolted from cover, weaving between shattered walls and debris. His heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline pushing him forward despite the danger. He could hear the Shorv machine's guns firing, but he kept his head low and his focus sharp. Every step was a calculated risk. The bridge loomed ahead, just a few hundred yards away. The Shorv machine was already moving into position, its massive frame towering over the terrain. But Eric didn't stop. He sprinted toward the bridge, ducking behind rocks for cover. He could hear the others firing behind him, keeping the Shorv forces distracted, but he couldn't afford to look back. His hands trembled slightly as he reached the detonator hidden in the rubble. The plan was simple: detonate the explosives at just the right moment, collapsing the bridge and sending the Shorv war machines into the ravine below. But the timing was critical. Too early, and the Shorv would move their troops to safety. Too late, and they would lose the element of surprise. Eric set the timer on the explosives, his mind racing. The bridge was just ahead, and the Shorv machine was closing in on his position. If he didn't make it back in time, the whole plan would fall apart. 5 seconds, he muttered to himself. He sprinted back, adrenaline surging through his veins. The roar of the war machine was deafening, and Eric knew that every second counted. The detonation sequence was set. All he had to do was get far enough away. He dove into the trench just as the first blast hit. The explosion shattered the air with a deafening roar. The earth shook beneath him, and the bridge collapsed in a massive cloud of dust and debris. The Shorv war machines screeched to a halt as the massive structure crumbled beneath them, sending them plummeting into the ravine below. For a moment, the battlefield fell silent. The Shorv had lost their advantage. The humans had struck back. But Eric knew this was only one victory in a much larger war. And as he rose to his feet, the sounds of the battle still raged around him. He realized something. He was no longer just a reluctant soldier. He was a part of something greater, something unbreakable. And he would fight until the very end. The dust from the collapsed bridge still hung thick in the air as Eric and his squad regrouped. The battlefield had been momentarily stilled, but the war was far from over. The Shorv were relentless, and Eric knew that even though they had dealt a severe blow, the enemy would adapt quickly. Victory had been snatched from the jaws of defeat, but it had come at a steep price. As the smoke cleared, Eric took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The overwhelming adrenaline of the last few minutes began to fade, replaced by a crushing fatigue. His body ached, his limbs heavy, but his mind remained focused. They had accomplished their objective. The bridge was down, and the Shorv were momentarily halted. That was all that mattered now. "Good work, Lawson," Kessler's voice crackled through the comms, thick with praise. "But don't get too comfortable. We've still got a war to win." Eric nodded, not trusting his voice to say anything in response. Instead, he scanned the horizon, noting the remaining shore forces regrouping, their war machines now slowly maneuvering away from the wreckage of the bridge. Their reinforcements were still closing in. The reprieve was brief, but it gave the humans a much-needed advantage, a window of opportunity. "I think we've earned a little rest," Mason said, his voice wry despite the circumstances. He sat down heavily, his back to a broken wall, his rifle resting at his side. "But don't get too used to it." "Rest is a luxury we can't afford," Eric said quietly, his gaze fixed on the battlefield ahead. "The shore will be back soon. We need to prepare for their counterattack." The squad nodded in agreement, and with renewed urgency, they started to reposition, reinforcing their defenses. The work felt mechanical now, a process honed by years of training and a string of battles that had taught them the harsh realities of war. Eric found himself moving in sync with his team, each soldier an extension of the other. In the heat of battle, it was easy to forget that they were all just people, flesh, blood, and bone, just like him. But in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was the bond they shared, forged by the fire of war. "We're not done yet," Kessler said, his voice serious as he surveyed the terrain. "Get those turrets set up. Mason, take the north flank. Eric, with me. Let's reinforce the south." Eric gave a sharp nod. There was no hesitation anymore. He moved swiftly, slipping into the position Kessler had indicated. He wasn't just following orders now. He was leading with them, becoming more than just the reluctant warrior he had once been. Each decision he made carried weight, and he understood the importance of every step. Suddenly, a rumble shook the earth. Eric's heart skipped a beat. The shore weren't just regrouping, they were launching their final push. Through the haze, he could see the silhouettes of their war machines advancing again, this time more cautiously, testing their new ground. "They're coming," Mason shouted across the comms. The air was filled with the shrill whine of incoming artillery. The ground trembled as the first shells slammed into the earth, sending shockwaves through their defenses. Eric gritted his teeth, his fingers tightening around his rifle. It was going to be a long fight. The shore had learned from their earlier defeat. This time, they would be prepared. A sharp crack of gunfire echoed in the distance, followed by a chorus of explosions. The enemy was relentless, and their fire was precise. Eric's heart raced, the adrenaline surging through his veins once more. He could hear the rapid exchange of gunfire, the thud of explosions as shells landed nearby, but he focused only on the task at hand. "Cover the south," Kessler yelled, drawing Eric's attention back to their position. "They're breaking through." Eric fired, his shots finding their mark as he crouched low behind a pile of debris. He could feel the heat of the plasma blasts as they tore through the air, narrowly missing him. His breath was shallow, his muscles tense, but his resolve was stronger than ever. With every round fired, every inch of ground held, Eric felt himself change. The fear that once crippled him, that had made him doubt his strength, was gone. The man who had joined this war as a reluctant soldier was no more. In his place stood a warrior, one who would fight to the very end. The shore war machines were closing in, but Eric's squad held their ground, determined to protect the human forces behind them. The battle had reached its climax, the moment of truth for them all. Each soldier knew what was at stake, and there would be no retreat. But then, just as the shore forces surged forward with renewed intensity, a low rumble from the distance interrupted the fight. Eric froze, a chill crawling down his spine. He looked to Kessler. "What's that sound?" Kessler didn't answer immediately, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. "That's no shore machine." Before he could finish his thought, the ground shook violently again. But this time, it wasn't from the enemy's artillery. It was something else, and it was coming straight toward them. The ground trembled beneath Eric's boots once more, a deep, resounding rumble that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. His instincts screamed for him to take cover, to ready himself for another assault, but something about the sound felt different. It wasn't the sharp, menacing thrum of shore war machines, or the oppressive blasts of their artillery. No, this felt larger, more powerful. "What the hell is that?" Mason's voice crackled through the comms, just as confused as Eric felt. Kessler didn't answer immediately. His face was tense, his eyes scanning the horizon, trying to make sense of the approaching sound. And then, as if a veil had been lifted, it appeared. From the distance, through the haze of smoke and dust, a massive shape loomed, a towering structure that seemed almost out of place on the chaotic battlefield. It was too large to be anything human-made. It was sleek, metallic, and glinted under the dying light of the afternoon sun. But what struck Eric most wasn't the size or the sheer power of the thing. It was the insignia emblazoned on its hull, one he hadn't seen in years. The symbol of the Terran Alliance. A burst of static cut through the air as the unmistakable voice of General Harper came over the comms. "All units, fall back. Reinforcements have arrived. Prepare to advance with Terran support." Eric's heart skipped a beat. Reinforcements? He'd thought they were alone, that the war was all but lost. But now, as he watched the behemoth warship descend toward the battlefield, he realized something profound. They weren't alone. Humanity had never given up. And now, it was time for their enemies to realize that. Kessler grinned, his expression relieved yet filled with awe. "I don't believe it. They're here." The Shorv, too, seemed to have noticed the incoming threat. They stopped in their tracks, hesitation flashing across their metallic faces as they turned to assess the massive ship now hovering above the battlefield. But it was too late. From the underside of the warship, a series of smaller dropships deployed, their thrusters blazing as they streaked toward the ground with incredible speed. They released a barrage of fire upon the shore forces, overwhelming their defenses in seconds. The human soldiers poured out, a new wave of reinforcements ready to join the fray, their weapons blazing. The battle shifted in an instant. Eric felt a surge of hope rise within him as the Terran forces descended onto the battlefield. Their presence was like a new breath of life. The Shorv were no longer the unstoppable force they had once seemed. For the first time in what felt like forever, Eric saw a flicker of light at the end of a very long tunnel. Humanity had not only survived, it was about to thrive. "Eric," Kessler shouted, snapping him out of his thoughts. "We need to keep the pressure on. They'll fall back if we push hard enough." Without waiting for a response, Eric dove back into the fray, his rifle at the ready. His squad followed suit, charging forward with renewed vigor, pushing the shore forces into disarray. The Terran reinforcements were like a tide, sweeping across the battlefield, leaving nothing in their wake but shattered enemies and broken machines. The Shorv tried to regroup, their war machines attempting to form a defensive perimeter, but the human forces were relentless. Eric's squad, now supported by the full might of the Terran Alliance, fought with a fury that could only come from knowing they were no longer fighting alone. For the first time in his life, Eric felt what it meant to be a part of something larger than himself. He was no longer the reluctant soldier, he was a warrior, a fighter, and he fought for something worth believing in. As the final shore forces retreated, the battlefield fell silent. The once dominant enemy now lay in ruins, their war machines abandoned, their soldiers scattered. The humans had triumphed, not just because of superior firepower or tactics, but because of something deeper, something that could never be taken away. Hope. The Terran Alliance forces rallied around Eric's squad, and General Harper herself appeared, her stern expression softening as she surveyed the scene. "Well done, soldier," she said, her eyes locking with his. "You've proven what we all know, that humanity's greatest strength lies in its heart. You found it in yourself when the odds were stacked against you. That's what makes us unstoppable." Eric swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was part of something greater, part of a collective force that could face any challenge. And as the sun set behind them, casting long shadows over the battlefield, he knew the war wasn't over yet. But humanity had found its strength, and nothing, not even the Shorv, could stand in its way. Together, they would rise again.